Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 222, The Chirnside Brothers. Thomas and Andrew Chirnside were prolific pastoralists. They were born at Cockburnspath, East Lothian, Scotland, and they were the youngest sons of 8 children born to Robert Chirnside, a farmer, and his wife, Mary Fair. Thomas and Andrew were the only children to emigrate to Australia. Firstly, Thomas. He was born on the 18th of January 1815 at Cockburnspath, Berwickshire, Scotland, and he sailed from Liverpool on the Barter Star and arrived at Adelaide in January 1839, and then by the March went on to Sydney. By the April, he had bought sheep on the Murrumbidgee, but because of the drought he left them there and went on to Melbourne, where he joined his brother Andrew, who'd arrived later in 1839. Andrew Spencer Chirnside was born 3 years after his brother on the 21st of January 1818 at Cockburnspath, Berwickshire, Scotland, and together the brothers went north, bought cattle and overlanded them to Adelaide. By way of Hobart Town they returned to Sydney and found the country had improved by rain, and they took their sheep to the Port Phillip district. By May 1840 they reached the Loddon and took up a run which they sold early in 1842, and in the April established a station at Mount William in the Grampians. Later that year, Thomas acquired a station on the Wannon and was the first in that district to employ Aboriginals as station hands. In 1843, the brothers bought Macanja Station and during the next few years acquired a chain of runs in the Western District of Victoria, including Victoria Lagoon in the Grampians, Kenilworth South, Wateryallock, Kurnong and Caranballoch. In 1846, they formed a station under occupation licence 64 kilometres east of Guichen Bay in South Australia, but the venture was not successful. Just before the gold rushes, the brothers began acquiring land at Wyndham, which is now known as Werribee, just near Melbourne. Andrew returned to England and he married Mary Begbie on the 10th of July 1850 at Haddington, East Lothian, Scotland, when he was 32 and Mary 22. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born in Scotland in September 1851. By 1853, Andrew moved back to Victoria with his new wife and child. Son Robert was born at Macanja Station at Cavendish in Victoria in 1853, followed by Andrew in 1856. Andrew made his base on the 50,000-acre property, Caranballoch Station near Skipton, where their son George was born in 1864, and John, born in 1865. The family returned to Scotland by 1868 when their daughter, Mary Matilda Chirnside, was born in that same year. The family lived in Scotland for 5 years and owned Skibo Castle in Sutherlandshire. Andrew also owned the 39,000-acre Mount Elephant Station, which his son later acquired nearly 24,000 acres at Court near Camperdown. Andrew Chirnside was extremely fond of horse racing. He was the founder and president of the Wyndham Racing Cup and he was steward of the Geelong Racing Club. His horse won the Melbourne Cup in 1874 with Haricot, and he also won the Newmarket and Midsummer Handicaps in 1876 with Sultan, the Geelong Gold Cup in 1880 with Zambezi, and the AJC Championship in 1881 with Spinningdale. He was also a patron of coursing. In 1874, he was elected a trustee of the Presbyterian Church property and in 1886 a trustee of the Mechanics Institute and Free Library. For many years he presided over the Wyndham Shire Council, but he took little other part in public affairs. In 1889 he created a half battery of horse artillery, equipped and maintained at his expense and commanded by his son John Percy. To Thomas Chirnside, Port Phillip was the Eden of all the colonies, and he found the people in the Western District thoughtful for the future, industrious and persevering, and willing to put their shoulder to the wheel and overcome all difficulties. At Wyndham, Thomas bred Herefords and imported bloodstock. He was an excellent judge of horses and he was a great sportsman.
He imported foxes, hares, pheasants and partridges, and his red deer from England formed the nucleus of the herd of the Anakis and Yuyangs. He was a burly man and something of a despot with a rough tongue and a manner when crossed, although Thomas had a kind heart. He was strictly a Sabbatarian. He would allow no work on his properties on Sundays. He donated an acre of his land and £100 for the first church in Werribee. In 1883, he was largely responsible for inviting Reverend William White from Scotland to take charge of St Thomas's Presbyterian Church. On the 5th of February 1884, Thomas laid the foundation stone of the second Presbyterian church in Werribee. Earlier, he and Andrew gave £1,000 to Ormond College as part of the University of Melbourne. In the 1840s, Thomas Chirnside was a member of the Geelong and Portland Bay Immigration Society Committee. From 1860 to 1863, he was director of the National Bank of Australasia. However, he was mostly busy with pastoral activities. These included entertaining the Shire ratepayers and their families, having picnics with games, bands and dancing for 1,000 people, and Thomas's appearance on his familiar horse would be greeted by resounding cheers. Thomas later built a bluestone mansion and gained a freehold of 80,000 acres that he called Werribee Park. In the 1870s, Andrew and his family moved to Wyndham, now Werribee, to live with Thomas. Construction of this mansion was completed in 1877 and it's one of the largest and most opulent properties in Victoria. It has 60 rooms across several wings and has a Renaissance revival style with a symmetrical 2-storey central block, a dominant tower and a ground-level arcade on 3 sides of the block. Its fine interior included some original furniture set within a richly decorated entrance hall containing a Minton or caustic tiled floor, Corinthian pilasters and freestanding columns leading to a grand staircase. The main reception rooms, library and dining room are classically ornamented. From 1884, Thomas Chirnside was plagued by sickness and he became morbidly depressed. He was a bachelor and had transferred most of his estate to his brother and nephews, but believing himself bankrupt, he shot himself on the 25th of June 1887, leaving an estate valued at £104,500. The Geelong Advertiser outlined his death on the 28th of June 1887, the late Thomas Chirnside. Mr Chirnside, who was a native of Berwickshire, was a very old colonist, having arrived in Victoria in 1839. From the first he was identified with pastoral pursuits, and he was conspicuous for his unbounded faith in the future of the colony. When at first other stock owners, disheartened by bad seasons, gave up and went to England or elsewhere, Mr Chirnside was always ready to buy their estates, as far as his means allowed, and his only regret was that his fortune at the time was not larger than it was in order that he might buy more land. The result was that his judgment and confidence in the resources and progress of Victoria was so fully justified that he died a millionaire. The Chirnside family, of which the deceased gentleman was a leading member, is still among the great landowning families of Australia, but in the latest returns of the Land Tax Register, the name of Mr Thomas Chirnside does not appear. It seems that recently he transferred to other members of his family his interests in the estates from which he was formerly the owner. As a sportsman, Mr Chirnside was prominently identified with racing, hunting and coursing. He had been keenly fond of sport since he was able to sit on a horse or carry a gun, and it was one of his axioms that a man could not be thoroughly healthy unless he rode fast and straight to hounds. In order to foster his favourite sport, he imported the first red deer to the colony, and these formed the nucleus of the deer herd, which still supplies the quarry of the Melbourne hounds when they visit Werribee Park. On these occasions, the members of the Melbourne Hunt Club were always most hospitably entertained by Mr Thomas Chirnside, who used to relate with pleasure that he obtained some of the deer which he brought to Victoria from the deer park of the late Prince Consort. It is said that Mr Chirnside also imported foxes. He was an excellent judge of bloodstock, but for the high-class stock acquired for Australia, it is questionable whether racing would be at present time hold such high a place in Victoria. In one shipment he had no fewer than 30 high-class broadmares and stallions, the produce which are running well this season at the Hawkesbury and at the AJC meetings. But it is, as the owner of the famous mare, Alice Hawthorne, and of the scarcely less celebrated colt Newminster, that Mr Chirnside's name is most conspicuously associated with the colonial turf. He won the Melbourne Cup with Harricott in 1874. Recently, he purchased at high prices some of the most notable yearlings offered this season by the New Zealand Stud Company. And another article on the 1st of July 1887 in the Mackay Times and Rodney Advertiser of Heathcote, Victoria. Warning, there is graphic information contained in this article. Suicide of Mr. Thomas Chirnside. Surprise and regret will be occasioned by the suicide of Mr. Thomas Chirnside, one of the well-known squatters at Werribee. Mr. Chirnside shot himself in the garden attached to his residence after midday on Saturday. The circumstances are of a peculiar shocking kind. He blew the top of his head clean off. A report of a firearm was heard by the inmates of the mansion, but no particular attention was paid to the circumstances at the time. Soon after, a nephew of the deceased, a son of his brother, Mr. Andrew Chirnside, found the body lying in the garden, some distance away, and a very shocking spectacle it presented. The deceased had taken off one of his boots and a sock from the same foot, and putting his toe in a piece of cord attached to the trigger of the gun caused its discharge. The body was removed to the library and seen by Dr. Fitzgerald of Melbourne and Mr. A. Blackwood, who'd gone down by special train. As far as we could learn, the deceased gentleman left no note or written intimation behind him referring to the act that he had, from appearance, clearly premeditated, but it is said that he had been heard to say that he was tired of life. It's also been said that he was dissatisfied with some recent speculations. There are other rumours, but the real cause, if it be known, may perhaps be elicited at the inquiry. The deceased was 72 years of age, he'd never been married, and was of several sons of a worthy Scotch family. The name of Chirnside has been familiar throughout Australia since the early days, and the vast tract of country surrounding the home of the deceased gentleman and his surviving brother, Andrew, who's been his partner for fully 40 years, was equally well known. Although he did not identify himself in any degree with public movements, and although he could not be termed a public man in the ordinary acception of the term, the deceased was a great reader and kept himself well versed in all events of the day. He was a man of good physique and apparently a sound constitution, had he not so suddenly ended his existence, have enjoyed a very much longer life. And on the 9th of July 1887 in the Melbourne Australia Asian. The career of Mr. Thomas Chirnside of Werribee Park, whose death we referred to last week, furnishes a striking example of the perseverance, energy and intrepidity which have characterised some of the lives of the early colonists, and to those qualities can be attributed much of the success which they have met with. The deceased gentleman was born in Berwickshire, Scotland in 1815, and at the age of 23 sailed for Sydney. After a tedious voyage, he arrived at Adelaide at the beginning of 1839 en route for his destination. Whilst the vessel was lying at the capital of South Australia, which was then a very small town, he went ashore, and having been brought up amongst stock and sheep, the breeding of which was the pursuit which he intended on his arrival in New South Wales to follow, he made inquiries respecting the value of them, and was somewhat surprised at the high prices which were quoted for them. In a day or two, the ship in which he came to Australia took its departure for its destination, and on reaching Sydney, he stayed a little while with the celebrated Dr. Lang, with whom he afterwards became most intimate. After inquiring into various matters with the view of shaping his future career in that colony, Mr. Thomas Chirnside, perceiving the low rates at which cattle were being disposed of in Sydney, decided to enter into his first colonial speculation by purchasing a mob and taking them overland to Adelaide, where he knew high rates were ruling. There was little difficulty in procuring the animals, but many obstacles and dangers had to be encountered and overcome before the market which with they were destined could be reached. There had been several journeys prior to the one which Mr. Chirnside undertook from Sydney to Adelaide, but those who had performed them returned with frightful accounts of conflicts with the Aboriginals, and sometimes of the murder of comrades by the Murray and other tribes of blacks whose ferocity and treachery were beginning to become commonly known, and to deter persons from performing the overland journey. In addition to that, there was always the risk of incurring privations in traversing a comparatively new and uninhabited country by running out of food. But despite all those drawbacks, the deceased determined to carry through his speculation at all hazards and embarked in it with a good deal of his capital. This fearlessness and courage brought the expected reward, but not, unfortunately, without the loss of life. He was accompanied by a drover, and despite the precautions which were taken to guard against a sudden attack at night, The party was surprised, and during the fight with the blacks, the drover was killed by them. The rest of the journey was performed without any eventful incidents, and on reaching Adelaide, Mr. Chirnside found a ready sale for the cattle at a price which fully compensated him for the dangers he'd undergone. After concluding this transaction, he returned to Sydney and came overland to Melbourne, which was then in its infancy, with cattle and bullock teams. He then took up a small station on Deep Creek at the headwaters of the Loddon, adjoining that of Mr. Lachlan McKinnon, one of the proprietors of the Argus, and it was there that he first made his attempts at sheep breeding. The station afterwards proved to be gold property and subsequently became known as the Clunes Diggings. But after working it for a year or so, Mr. Thomas Chirnside was not altogether satisfied with its prospects as a run and sold out and returned again to Sydney. At this time, in 1840, his brother, Mr. Andrew Chirnside, came out to Melbourne on his way to Sydney, but received a letter from him and stayed in Melbourne, and soon after travelled halfway overland to Sydney and met him. The two brothers then entered into a partnership which has lasted ever since. They went to Gundagai and stayed a few weeks at Mr. Merchant Campbell's station, and then commenced their successful pastoral career by purchasing 700 pure merino sheep in the Goulburn district. These they drove overland to the foot of Mount William in the Grampians, which is the highest mountain in Victoria, taking up a run there, which was called after the mount. They followed the track of Major Mitchell, the well-known explorer, who had been the first to cross that portion of the country in 1836, about 4 or 5 years previously. And Mr. Stevens had previously taken up land in the vicinity of this run, but he had to abandon it in consequence of the hostility and depredations of the Aboriginals. An incident which serves to show the watchfulness and treachery of the natives occurred whilst the party was on its way to Mount William from the Goulburn district. Owing to the intense heat of the midday sun at that time of the year, the sheep used to travel in the cool of the morning and the evening only, so as to rest and escape the scorching rays of the sun at noon. The party as a rule kept together, but one morning, when the bullock driver and his team and dray were late in starting and were left some distance behind, those driving the sheep had got out of sight of the bullock driver, and he was suddenly pounced upon by the blacks, who mounted the dray and began throwing the provisions about. He managed to get possession of his gun, and the natives, perceiving him pointing it at them, took fright and decamped. Mr. Chirnside always treated the Aboriginals kindly whilst at Mount William, and occasionally a tribe consisting of 300 or 400 blacks and their lubras would hang for days about the place, and they not unfrequently stole and killed sheep on that and the adjoining stations. Although they professed friendliness, experience had taught Mr. Chirnside not to show too much confidence in them. Whilst he and Mr. Logan were ploughing their fields, they constantly carried guns with them, not knowing at what moment might be required to use them for the protection of their lives. This steady vigilance was a great strain on the mind and nerves, and one cannot help contrasting the dangers which then surrounding the lives of the colonists residing in the remote districts, where the nearest neighbour was perhaps 30 to 50 miles away. Shortly after occupying Mount William, Mr. Thomas Chirnside purchased Wodayallock Station in the county of Grenville, and his then partner Mr. John Ross, who was manager of the station in the Goulburn district where he purchased his first flock of sheep when he met him, took up Glenfine Station close by. The first clip realised about £2,000, but the cost of transportation to the seaboard was so heavy that after all expenses were paid, a very large profit did not remain. About 3 years after, the Chirnside brothers had taken up the Mount William run, which they still hold and which they added to by purchases until it now comprised of 50,000 acres. They then bought Macanja Station near Dunkeld, which was 48,000 acres. But a general depression a year or so afterwards fell upon the settlers of Port Phillip in consequence of bad seasons, and they were willing or were compelled to dispose of their properties at whatever they could get for them. There was an almost universal outcry against the prospects of the colony at that time, and it required a good deal of confidence in its future welfare and nerve to purchase properties when the general tendency was to sell out all risks. Mr. Thomas Chirnside possessed both these qualities, and by keen foresight with which he was gifted and a competent knowledge of the value of stock and land, he invested all the capital he could then command, alongside with his brother Andrew, in the purchase of properties, which subsequently served as a nucleus for the several splendid stations which they owned in Victoria and by adding by purchases from time to time, their estates increased to a size which made them admittedly rank amongst the largest of the colonial landed proprietors. In this way, the Chirnside brothers became possessed of Kurnong Station, which was afterwards embraced in Caranballoch, a splendid station of 61,000 acres near Skipton, and they also purchased the well-known Mount Elephant property near Lismore, consisting of 30,000 acres. Shortly before the discovery of the goldfields, Thomas began acquiring property at the Werribee. He always had a predilection for the place and frequently spoke then of it as being the future place of his residence. It was close to Melbourne and was suited for the depasturing of sheep and was well watered by the Werribee River, and it was close to the shores of the bay. He bought a block of 10 acres from one and 300 from another and kept on buying out persons, mostly small holders in the vicinity, though he had, contrary to general impression, which seems to prevail amongst the community now, to pay in many instances some high prices for the land, as his desire to form an estate there became known amongst the residents. The estate which he succeeded in forming within about 20 miles of Melbourne embraced altogether 85,000 acres and carried 63,000 sheep. It extends from the recently formed township of Laverton to Little River on one hand and from the You Yangs Range to the bay on the other. When the Melbourne to Geelong Railway was mooted 30 years ago, Thomas gave the company which formed that line a strip of land about a couple of chains in width, extending right through his property free of cost, on condition that a station should be placed at Werribee. Of course, the railway enhanced the value of his property, and the fact of its passing through the centre of it for some miles gave the estate a fame which was widely extended, as thousands of people yearly passed through it, the Geelong line being the greatest trunk one for all those in the Western District. The first dwelling, which was of humble construction and dimensions, which Mr. Chirnside occupied on the banks of the Werribee, has passed out of existence, but the comfortable bluestone cottage which he built shortly after taking up his abode remains intact and is used as offices. The magnificent mansion which he planned and was constructed some years ago at Werribee Park of solid bluestone and faced with cement is a conspicuous landmark both for those travelling by sea and rail to and from Geelong to Melbourne, but it is comparatively so far distant from the railway line and from the course taken by steamers, as well as being surrounded by a beautiful garden and lofty tiers, that its largeness is not fully realised until the visitor approaches near to it. It is believed to be one of the most splendid dwellings in the colonies and cost £100,000. The deceased gentleman had a wonderful constitution, and the not infrequent exposures to inclement weather, in which he had to contend against in his early days whilst camping out at night, did not appear to affect it in the slightest degree. He was characterised by great energy and industry in his younger days, helped to build a jetty at Point Cook, where his wool was shipped prior to the making of the railway, and he was an untiring rider. After working hard on one of the stations during the day and pondering over accounts and correspondence till late in the night, he would rise early in the morning, sometimes before daybreak, and mounted a horse and would ride miles across the country to his other runs. Frequent overtures were made to him to enter into the mining speculations after the discovery of gold at Ballarat and Bendigo, but he declined them. He confined his business solely to sheep breeding, principally of the merino class. He bought Ballilla, a station on the Darling near Wilcannia in New South Wales in 1875. It was surrounded by a wallaby-proof fence by him at a great expense and carried 60,000 sheep. A few years later he purchased 2 runs in Queensland, Retro near Capella and Vindex in the western part, but in common with other settlers there, he encountered severe droughts. In conjunction with one of his nephews, he took up Doners Hill Station near Normanton on the Gulf of Carpentaria. An impression then prevailed that sheep would not thrive in a tropical district, owing to the intense heat, but the satisfactory prices obtained for their wool dispersed that idea. Thomas made several voyages to England, and whilst on a visit to Scotland he purchased a large property known as Skirbow Castle in Sutherlandshire, and was appointed a deputy lieutenant by the Duke of Sutherland. He, however, disposed of that place and bought Ballantor close to Perth, which contained some splendid shooting grounds, and it was for that reason principally that he purchased it. Andrew was left in possession of Werribee Park, but died on the 30th of April 1890 at Irrawarra, near Colac, in Victoria, aged 72. And Andrew's death was outlined in the Melbourne Australian on the 3rd of May 1890. It is with regret we record the death of Mr. Andrew Chirnside, which occurred at the residence of his daughter, Mrs. John Calvert of Irrawarra, Colac, a little past 1 o'clock on the 30th of April. The deceased gentleman had been in poor health for some time and suffered chiefly from an affection of the heart. Not long ago he visited Queensland and afterwards took a trip to Tasmania for a change, but he was eventually obliged to take his bed, with the result that he died as stated. By the death of Mr. Chirnside, the colony of Victoria has lost another one of its pioneers. From the very earliest days of settlement in the southern portion of Australia, the name of the Chirnside family has been widely known as associated with pastoral prosperity and the ownership of vast tracts of land. Mr. Andrew Chirnside was born at Berwickshire, Scotland in 1817 and was 73 years of age at the time of his death. His brother, the late Mr. Thomas Chirnside, came to Port Phillip in 1839, over 50 years ago, and took up an extensive tract of country on the western shore of Port Phillip between Melbourne and Geelong, the greater part of which has been known as Werribee Park Estate. Mr. Andrew Chirnside was not long in following his brother to the new land, arriving in 1840, and after a time he acquired the Caramballoch Estate, a magnificent grazing property of 50,000 acres near Skipton in the Western District. An opportunity offered, Mr. Chirnside purchased other valuable station properties, not only in this colony but in New South Wales and Queensland. The principal estates in Victoria which came into his hands, besides Caramballoch, were the Mount Elephant Station of 38,900 acres of fine grazing land in the Shire of Hampden, and Court Coonong near Camperdown, comprising of nearly 24,000 acres. Whilst in conjunction with his nephew, Mr. James Forbes, he owned Mount William Estate, 50,000 acres near Ararat, and Ballantor Station, consisting of 4,000 acres of splendid land near Colac. Mr. Andrew Chirnside resided for some time at Caramballoch, but 20 years ago he entered into a partnership arrangement with his brother Thomas in regards to the Werribee property and took up residence there. Early in the 50s, Mr. Thomas Chirnside had acquired the fee simple of the entire estate, which after a number of blocks had been cut up and sold for farming purposes, still contained upwards of 80,000 acres. The land is well watered by the Werribee River and the Kokorok Creek and consists of level and open plains, but its great value arises from its proximity to the chief markets of the colony, the estate being 20 miles from Melbourne. In 1853, 2 years after the discovery of gold, the land boom was experienced, which while it lasted caused a great deal of ferment and gave rise to many bold projects. Among these were the attempted creation of a new township a little to the south of Mr. Chirnside's property at the Werribee, almost within sight of the bay, and one of the original plans and conditions of sale is now in possession of Mr. Wilmot, the well-known surveyor of William Street. The township was to have been known by a no less auspicious name than that of Glasgow, and an entire block of 320 acres owned by Mr. Gilbert was cut up into building lots. Some 12 or 15 years ago, the Chirnside brothers built a mansion at Werribee Park, which is among the finest country houses in Victoria, and it has since on numerous occasions witnessed the liberal hospitality of its owners. The annual picnic which was given to the tenants was always attended also by many visitors from Melbourne, and the leading coursing clubs in the colony were glad to avail themselves of the advantages for sport which the estate offered. It is in connection with sport, indeed, that the Chirnside family became best known to the general public. Mr. Thomas Chirnside was an ardent lover of racing and began the importation of thoroughbred horses over 30 years ago. Mr. Andrew Chirnside's studs have furnished many animals whose names have been familiar on the turf. The tragic death of his brother occurred 3 years ago, and the entire property at Werribee was left in his hands. Mr. Andrew Chirnside was for many years president of the Wyndham Shire Council, but beyond that took little part in public affairs. There is one act, however, for which the whole colony is indebted to him, and for which he has received well-merited praise, and that is the patriotic offer which resulted in the creation last year of a half-battery of horse artillery, equipped and maintained entirely at his expense. Sir William Clark had set the example several years before in the formation of the Rupert's Wood Battery, and Mr. Chirnside's public-spirited action gave much gratification both to the military authorities and the public at large. 30 horses were purchased and placed at the disposal of the new troop, an orderly room was erected at the cost of £600, and a fund was provided for uniforms and equipment, and a salary of a drill sergeant, the cost of maintenance being no less than £1,000 a year. Mr. Percy Chirnside is lieutenant in command of the battery and has a fine group of horsemen under his control. The deceased gentleman leaves a wife and 4 sons and 2 daughters. Robert Chirnside, his eldest son, some time ago was transferred the Caringbulloch property. Mr. Andrew S. Chirnside owns the Mount Elephant Station and Courtnong, and the 2 youngest sons, George and Percy, were last year given an interest in Werribee Park. One of the daughters is married to Mr. John Colvert of Colac. And on the 7th of August 1890, in the Camperdown Chronicle in Victoria, the will of the late Mr. Andrew Chirnside of Werribee Park has been filed for probate. The property in Victoria was sworn at £358,500, personalty £64,500, and he also had property in Queensland. He leaves his widow a legacy of £10,000 and an annuity of £5,000. He bequeaths to his sons George Thomas Chirnside and John Percy Chirnside all of his shares and interests in Werribee Park and the Point Cook estate. He leaves £40,000 and £60,000 in trust for his daughters, Margaret Fair Colvert and Mary Matilda Chirnside, respectively. All his other property is to be held for his sons Robert and Andrew, and a sum not exceeding £250 per annum is to be given at the discretion of the trustees to charitable, religious or benevolent objects or to individuals. Werribee Park Mansion was converted into a seminary in the 1920s, and then the entire estate was purchased by the Victorian State Government in 1977. Andrew and Mary Chirnside's children. Their firstborn was Margaret Fair Chirnside, who was born on the 5th of September 1851 in Haddingtonshire, East Lothian, Scotland. Margaret married John Colvert on the 9th of October 1872 at the family property Caringbulloch at Streatham, and John owned Illawarra in Colac. They had 7 children, and Margaret died on the 31st of August 1927 at Irrawa Station at Colac, her home, aged 75. The second child was Robert. He was born on the 11th of April 1853 at Macandra Station near Cavendish in Victoria. Robert built Mount Rothwell Homestead in 1873 on his property of 90,000 acres that included Werribee Mansion and Point Cook Homestead. It remained in the Chirnside family as Mount Rothwell Station until the year 2000. Robert married Alice Belinda Ware in 1880 in Victoria when he was 27 and Alice 21. Alice's father, Joseph Ware, owned Minjar Station at Caramut. They had 5 children, and Robert died on the 4th of January 1900, aged only 46. His death was outlined in the Ararat Advertiser and Chronicle for the Stawell and Wimmera districts on the 9th of January 1900. Very deep regret was expressed by residents both of the town and neighbourhood on Friday last when it became known that Mr. Robert Chirnside of Caringbulloch, Skipton, had somewhat unexpectedly expired. For a considerable time past, the deceased had been suffering from a pulmonary affection, and his ultimate recovery was regarded as almost hopeless. But at the beginning of winter, he was ordered by his medical advisors to go to Deniliquin. Here he greatly improved his health, and the hope was that with great care his life might be prolonged. Last week, as the summer advanced and the deceased gentleman was in excellent spirits and appeared to be, comparatively speaking, strong and well, and commenced his return to Caringbulloch. On reaching Bendigo, however, hemorrhage of the lungs set in and gradually sunk and passed away peacefully at the Shamrock Hotel in Bendigo on Thursday afternoon. The deceased was the son of the late Andrew Chirnside and brother of Andrew George and Percy Chirnside, and was 46 at the time of his death. He leaves a widow and a young family to mourn his loss. He was a most kindly and thoughtful husband and father. The remains of the deceased gentleman were removed to Geelong on Sunday by special train and interred in the family vault. The cortege consisted of a flower-laden hearse, 6 mourning coaches and a large number of private vehicles. Flags were floating at half-mast high above the woolbrokers' offices and other places in the city on the day of the funeral. Mr. Robert Chirnside, who for many years resided in the district at his Mount William estate, was one of the best known, and we may add, best appreciated of the public men of this locality. The broad view he took on all public matters, the keen grasp he displayed of all questions affecting the social and political life of the people of the colony, his rectitude and probity, and his high sense of honour, made him a person of unquestioned merit, and all regretted when his failing health compelled him to relinquish the positions that he so well and honourably filled. Mr. Chirnside for 15 years filled the position of councillor at the Shire of Ararat and was twice its president, and in both offices he won the good esteem both of the ratepayers and his fellow councillors. Prior to his retirement 2 years ago, he was on more than one occasion solicited to place his services at the disposal of the electors for the parliamentary honours, both in this and in the Ballarat district, and on each occasion he found it necessary to decline. He was a keen sportsman and a generous supporter of district race clubs, and for many years was a steward and a president of the Ararat Club, a position he occupied at the time of his death. There was no one who knew the late Mr. Chirnside that did not recognise and admit his kindly and manly qualities, and all will join in regretting the too early death of one of those whom they held in the highest esteem. On the 5th of July 1902 in the Geelong Advertiser, it outlines Robert Chirnside's will. Mr. Robert Chirnside of Mount Rothwell was apparently not as wealthy a man as people expected. Today's will was lodged for probate. His real estate was valued at nearly £73,000, the personalty at nearly £11,000, totalling £83,000. The property is left to his widow and children. His widow is granted £500 for immediate use and an annuity of £800. Andrew and Mary's third child was Andrew Jr., Andrew Spencer Chirnside, who was born at Cavendish in 1856. He married Winifred Grace Summer in 1893 in Victoria, when Andrew was 37 and Grace 25. They had a daughter, Joan. He owned Currangulak near Biak in Victoria. He died on the 17th of April 1934 in Fitzroy, Victoria, aged 78. And on the 21st of April 1934, his death was outlined in the Melbourne Weekly Times. The death occurred on the 17th of April in a private hospital of Mr. Andrew Spencer Chirnside, pastoralist of Edrington, Berwick, and Vide at Derrinellum. He'd only been ill a few days. The late Mr. Chirnside was one of the leading pastoralists of Victoria and a prominent sheep breeder. He had at one time interests all over the state, but of recent years he sold most of them and devoted his activities to Vide. Mr. Chirnside was the oldest member of the Melbourne Club and one of the founders of the Victoria Amateur Turf Club. He was also a member of the Victorian Racing Club and owned many well-known racehorses. In his youth, he was regarded as one of the best amateur riders in Australia. Mr. Chirnside's only daughter, Joan, who is married to Mr. Alec Waugh, the English novelist, came to Australia recently to visit her mother, but left on a return trip about a fortnight ago. Her father's health then was causing concern. Mrs. Chirnside was severely injured in a motor accident a year ago and is now in a private hospital in Melbourne. In 1875, Mr. Chirnside was a member of an exploring party in Central Africa, and he later made several trips to Africa on big game shooting expeditions. Captain Percy Chirnside of Brandon Park, Oakley, and Mr. George Chirnside of Lilydale are brothers. Mr. Chirnside's death robs Australian turf of one of its most picturesque pioneers. As a youth, he rode successfully as an amateur in country meetings. The fourth child, George Thomas Chirnside, was born in 1864 in Skipton, Victoria, and he died on the 25th of May 1940, and his obituary was placed in the Werribee Shire Banner. The death occurred on Sunday at his home, Murrelbark Park in Lilydale, of Mr. George Thomas Chirnside, who until 20 years ago resided in Werribee at his palatial home on Werribee Park Estate. Until Mr. Chirnside sold his Werribee mansion, which is now known as Corpus Christi College, and is used for training priests for the Catholic clergy, he was regarded as, and definitely proved his claims to being the leading citizen of the district. He was an ex-president of the Werribee Shire Council, and Mr. Chirnside devoted all of his attention to furthering the interests of Werribee as a whole. His numerous good works will always be remembered, especially by the older residents of the district, and many will have cause to regret his passing. As a mark of respect to his memory, the flag over the Shire Hall was flown half-mast on Monday and Tuesday until the funeral passed through Werribee on its way to the Eastern Cemetery at Geelong, where the remains were interred. And it also mentioned that George Thomas Chirnside was Australia's foremost breeder of Jersey cattle. The fifth child, John Percy Chirnside, was born on the 3rd of October 1865 at Caramballoch Station at Skipton. On returning to Australia from their time in Scotland, Percy was educated at the Geelong Church of England Grammar School, and he then travelled with a tutor for 2 years, visiting nearly every country in the world. Then for the next few years he lived at Werribee Park, the mansion built by his father and Uncle Thomas, and he shared his enthusiasm with his siblings for hunting, coursing, polo and shooting. Percy was bent on a military career, and he was a commissioned lieutenant in the Victorian Field Artillery Brigade in June 1887, and 2 years later his father agreed to contribute to the cost of raising and maintaining a half battery of horse artillery at Werribee, of which Percy took command. Horses, uniforms, drill hall and stables were provided by his father, and half of the sergeant major's instructor's salary. When his father died in 1890, Percy and his brother George, who jointly inherited the Werribee estate, continued to maintain the half battery. Percy went to England and did further training at Woolwich and Aldershot, and then returned. He was promoted captain in January 1893, but in February the government disbanded the Werribee half battery rather than meet the cost of replacing obsolete guns. He was then placed on a reserve of officers in the March and retired in October 1897. In September 1894, standing as an independent tariff reformer, Percy won the seat of Grant in the Victorian Legislative Assembly. He regarded himself as a Liberal Conservative. He was rarely vocal in the House. He maintained a particular interest in defence matters, and he was popular amongst his constituents. He did not stand for re-election in May 1904, when the seat disappeared in a redistribution. On the 22nd of February 1893, at All Saints Church in St Kilda, he married Ethel Mary Fenner. They honeymooned in Japan, America and England, and they returned to live at Werribee, where they built a home on the estate called the Manor. Percy mainly ran merino sheep, but he also had a stud of milking shorthorn cattle, and he imported many top-quality animals. By 1910, almost the whole property was let in tenant farms or had been sold in farm blocks, and in 1921 he moved to Brandon Park near Oakley, where he founded a stud herd of Jersey cattle. In June 1905 he was appointed a CMG, and after World War I he received an OBE. During the war he served in England and with the remounts section of the British Army, and he was twice mentioned in dispatches. He died on the 6th of January 1944. They had 3 sons and 1 daughter, but his daughter predeceased him. In 1946, when his family was reunited in Australia, there was a memorial service held for him at St Thomas's Church of England in Werribee, where his ashes were scattered on the banks of the river. An obituary was written in the Melbourne Argus on the 7th of January 1944. Captain John Percy Chirnside, CMG OBE of Brandon Park, Oakley, died at a private hospital yesterday. He was the last surviving member of the family of the late Andrew and Mary Chirnside of Werribee Park, Werribee, one of the most widely known pastoral pioneering families of the state. Captain Chirnside was 79, and after selling the manor in 1922 he bought Brandon Park in Oakley, a smaller property where he lived until his death. He is survived by his widow, who was in England, and 3 sons. His sons are Major P.E.F. Chirnside, who has served in the 8th Hussars of the British Army for many years and is presently serving in India. Squadron Leader A.B. Chirnside of the RAAF is at present stationed in the north, and Mr. John Chirnside of Brandon Park. His daughter Molly, who married Major Nicholas Charlton, lost her life in a fire in England last year. There'll be a private funeral. The 6th child, Mary Matilda, known as Muffy, married Everard Brown, the son of Thomas Brown, also known as author Rolf Boldrewood, who I featured in episode 58. Mary was born on the 15th of January 1868 in Scotland. Mary and Everard were married on the 11th of September 1894 at Werribee Park, when Mary was 26 and Everard 30. They had 2 daughters, Gwened in South Yarra in 1899 and Everard Jr. in 1902 at Coorook House at Werribee. Mary died on the 25th of March 1934 in Marylebone, London, and there was a small article in the Melbourne Argus upon her death. Her many friends will regret to learn of the death of Mrs. Everard Brown of Coorook House, Colac, which occurred in London on Sunday. Mrs. Brown leaves 2 daughters, Mrs. Dermot Casey, who left hurriedly a short time ago for London on receipt of the news of her mother's illness, and Mrs. John Ritchie of Berwick in Hamilton, Victoria. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the Chirnside brothers. They were certainly very influential in the early pastoral settlements of Victoria.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.